Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's Kaffeepause. Each week, we're joined by a journalist based in Berlin to talk about the news stories behind the headlines. And today, we're joined by Steven Erlanger. He is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, and he's based in Berlin. And he's been reporting from Saxony and Thuringia in the run-up to Sunday's parliamentary elections in those two states. Steve, it's great to see you as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to do it.
So let me maybe set the stage a little bit, because I don't know if everybody who's tuned in has been following the election results as closely as you and perhaps I have. There was a significant lurch to the right in the regional elections in the eastern states of Thuringia and Saxony. This was anticipated, but for the first time in the post-war era, a confirmed right-wing extremist party has won a state election in Germany. In Thuringia, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, under the leadership of the right-wing Björn Höcke, has come in far ahead of the other parties with 32.8% of the vote. And in Saxony, it ended up a close second after the Christian Democrats, the CDU. The Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, the BSW, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which was only launched 8 months ago and champions a left conservative nationalism, gained third place with double-digit results in both states. There was a fairly high voter turnout with about 74% of eligible voters turning out in both Thuringia and Saxony. And so I'd imagine that yesterday and today, there's been a bit of a shell-shocked feel in Berlin. That's certainly what I've picked up from the German media coverage that I've seen over the last couple of days, that the results were not necessarily a surprise, but they're shocking nevertheless and have consequences for the political parties in the government at the federal level, for the Ampel. But maybe we'll get into that in just a few minutes. Steve, I'd like to start with my general question of sort of what's the mood in Berlin after these elections, and then maybe we can talk about some of your takeaways from these elections in Saxony and Thuringia.
Well, when we talk about the mood, we're kind of talking about the chattering classes. And the chattering classes are, as you said, rather shell-shocked. I mean, the polls were pretty good, but as usual, the AfD does better in the vote than in the polls, because there's a bit of a reluctance to say you're voting AfD. In Thuringia, if you kind of add together AfD and Wagenknecht and the left, Die Linke, you get close to 50% of the vote. So this is pretty remarkable. And what troubles people in Berlin, even though these are two small states in Eastern Germany, maybe 7% of the whole German population, the FDP, part of the ruling coalition, didn't get 5% in either state. In fact, didn't even get 2%. So it didn't get any seats. It didn't get any seats, got about 1.5%. The Greens barely snuck into Saxony. They missed out on Thuringia. And the Chancellor's Party, the Social Democrats, had really a bad showing, 6-7%. So what Berlin has to say to these voters is very little. And I think that's the issue. That's what bothers people. I mean, it's not just the wall in the head. It's really, you have two very, very different notions of politics and where Germany should be and where it should be going. And I think this is now the country, in reaction to this government, which is pretty paralyzed, has been moving a little more to the right anyway, to the center right. The CDU, for example, did quite well, I think, comparatively in both these elections. It did win just by 1% of the vote. in Saxony, came a good second in Thuringia. So it may end up running both state governments, but the coalitions will be very hard. And there will be very serious issues about who will go with Sarah Wagenknecht and whether she can be part of any coalition that works. So there are a lot of issues at stake, and Berlin is shaken but not stirred, I would say. Some people, the Greens, have been saying now for weeks, oh, the government's out of ideas and so on, but it's hard to imagine it's going to break up. It could break up, but if it breaks up and faces the electorate, everybody will do badly. So, I mean, why race toward extinction is the question.
So, Steve, you've put a lot on the table, and I'd like to come back and maybe focus in a little bit more detail on the two states and sort of the path forward in each of those states in just a moment. But staying a little bit further back for a moment, you talked a little bit about the divergence between Eastern and Western states. We certainly saw this in the European elections at the beginning of the summer, right? In June, when the European elections took place, we saw a major split between East and West. And so there was a sense from those results, but also, as you said, from the polls, that the AfD would do well, that the other sort of parties on the extremes, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, the Left Party, the Linkspartei, would sort of take votes away from the center, the political center. Do you think that these results sort of confirm a growing divergence between East and West? Is that one way to look at this? Is that very telling in that sense?
Well, I think it does. I don't know if it's a growing divergence. It's been growing for some time. I mean, there's a very good political scientist at Humboldt called Stefan Mau, who's written a very good book about this. Other people, the Stern reporter in Thuringia, Martin Debes, has also written quite a good book about this. Part of it is the history, which we know. Part of it is a kind of lingering anti-Americanism. Part of it is worries about the war. Part of it's disinformation. Part of it is just this feeling in the East that we've been colonized twice over, and we the people versus the elite, and the elite is in Berlin, right? So, this, and also there's far less party loyalty in the East, partly because the DDR had only one party.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a lot of free-floating votes, right? I mean, there have been other parties in the past in the East that have done well and have sort of faded. But I do think this is fairly serious because the AfD is pretty well plugged in. It's very good on social media. It's good on clubs and associations in the East. And even in the West, I mean, it's in, I think, 14 of the state parliaments anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it, in the polls, is about a little less than half of what it was in East Germany, but it's still a significant factor. So that raises the question we can talk about. What do you do about the AfD? What do you do about these extremes? But I do think there really is a sense, and this is Stefan Mau's argument, that you're almost developing two different political systems in the East and in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And what that augurs for Germany, who knows? But it's not a great sign. And it seems to have, frankly, not that much to do with money, because the people in the East are doing pretty well. I mean, they really are. Unemployment's low and so on. But these issues of, values and identity and what it is to be a German, and is Germany somehow being pushed around by America, and are migrants getting a better deal than we are? And there's also this very strong feeling in the East, like the elites and a lot of the elites in the East are from the West also, the elites want to cure the world more than they worry about Germans. So that when Hücke, who plays with Nazi language, I mean, he says Germany for the Germans, everybody shudders because it's kind of a Nazi slogan. But, you know, if Trump said America for the Americans, nobody would wink, right? So there's a kind of neuralgia, which is real, and which Berlin feels because it's very conscious of its outside image. And it is very nervous, you know, having seen the rise of an extremist right-wing party. Nobody's saying this is going to happen again. But the AfD is, particularly the two state branches in Saxony and Thuringia, have been found to be extremist, have extremist elements in the AfD. And so all the other parties have built still a firewall around them, unlike the rest of Europe, I should say, a cordon sanitaire, which I think will last this time. It doesn't exist around Wagenknecht, around BSW, because she is a constitutional party. She believes in German democracy. She has no issue of Nazism to her. She just comes out of the hard left and basically is partly eating AfD's lunch. I mean, some of the same issues about migration and who's doing best for the Germans and what about Ukraine, and we don't trust Putin, but the war should end, and the Americans want to put more missiles into Germany, so this makes everything more dangerous, and blah, 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 blah. But these things touch nerves, nerves that have been built for 40 years and more, and nerves that obviously are still alive and vibrant and touchable.
So related to all of this and just sort of the mood, you know, one of the polls that I saw from Saxony was that something that many of the voters for the AfD and for Wagenknecht's party that they have in common is a sense that East Germans are still second-class citizens, that they're not treated fairly, that they're not treated well. And you alluded to this, right? That East Germans are doing fairly well, but there's still the perception that they've been left behind. Did you find that as you were reporting from the East ahead of time?
To some degree, yes, partly because, you know, you understand in a way why Ulbricht built the wall in the first place, because once it fell, not all, many of the intelligent women especially went westward. I mean, they went westward for a million reasons, but they haven't come back. They've gotten married, had kids. There is a real problem of demography in the East. It's a much older population. It's a more male population. It's a less multi-culti population. It's more pensioners. Pensions are not great. And also, given the DDR, there was very little capital accumulation by individuals in East Germany. It wasn't like West Germany. It wasn't like a saving society. And even if it was a saving society, those savings disappeared pretty quickly. I mean, you know, many people left after 89, and many companies shut, and many people lost their jobs, and they lost quite a lot and lived through some really hard times, I think. Now it's gotten better, but still there is this sense that, you know, the Westies just think the DDR was a joke and these people's lives were a waste, and you know, the institutions they built were worthless and the companies they built were bankrupt, and it's very hard to find an East German company that still makes quite a lot of money that isn't even being run by a West German. So in a way, they are second-class citizens, to be honest.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our viewers that sort of ties in here. Our viewer asks, how much do these election outcomes reflect concerns about German fiscal policy? Are the coalition government's budget squabbles partly to blame for their poor showing and for the FDP's especially low support?
Hard to know. It's not, it doesn't come out a lot in the polling that I've seen. I think people generally they say we're so rich, so why is there so little money?
Yeah.
I mean, you hear that. I mean, economics matters, pensions matter, the size of pensions. The feeling people have, which is a bit unfair, but the migrants, particularly even those from Ukraine, they come and they get everything.
Hmm.
And we have to struggle with what we have, and our pensions are low compared. And actually, there should be rules. And the people have come, let's say, even from Ukraine, they go back to Ukraine and they're handling two households and they're not working. And Katja Wolf, was the BSW lead candidate in Thuringia, said, there's a real feeling that the Ukrainians, we welcome them. They're filling our schools, they're filling our hospitals, but they're not working in the way we expected them to work. They're not going to work. And this kind of feels very troubling to people. And then there is partly just the sense, I mean, I used to live in Moscow and I traveled a lot in the Eastern countries. My first visit to Germany was to Hauptstadt der DDR in 1981. But there is this kind of nobody immigrated to the Soviet bloc,
Hmm.
right? I mean, people tried to get out, but it's not like people were clamoring to get into the Soviet Union or into East Germany. They were kind of protected from the world, and protected from the waves of the world. And that stopped when the wall fell. And so they have migrants now, not in huge numbers, to be honest. I mean, 2015, you have a lot of young Muslim kids who even are trying to integrate, right? But um, they're they've become an issue in East Germany. The AfD has one of its slogans, which I won't get exactly right, but basically it says Heimat, not Multikulti,
Hmm.
and I think that tells you a lot, right? It tells you a lot about identity. It tells you a lot about wanting to preserve a kind of Germanness that is protected still from the world and migration and changes. And, one can consider it naive, but politically it works.
Hmm. So let's turn to each of the states, because there are nuances in each state, and talk a little bit about sort of what the path forward might be. Um, on Sunday, Bjorn Höcke, the head of the AfD, was saying that the AfD would be looking for coalition partners. This is probably not going to happen given the firewall that you were talking about. Um, uh, you had mentioned earlier that the Christian Democrats, the CDU, want to govern in Thuringia, but that they do not have majority. There are, I guess, there's one real option, to try to govern together with the minister president, Bodo Ramelow, who's now out of a job, the head of the left party in Thuringia. Um, where do you see this playing
Right.
out? What do you think the options are
Well,
moving
it's hard,
forward?
Steve. You're absolutely right. Because I mean, I had a long talk with Bodo Ramelow, who's a very, very good guy, but I mean, he hid the fact that he was standing for Die Linke during the campaign because he was personally the more popular choice to continue to run the state, to be, I guess, minister president.
Yeah.
But his party did badly.
He
So
did well, right? His personal election results were very, very
yes, no, he's was
42%. I
by
mean,
far the most popular
yeah.
person people had when they were asked. But the CDU guy, Mario Foth, is intelligent, not very charismatic. But, they've picked up some of the talk about being tougher on migration and more deportations and all the rest of it. The CDU needs a partner in the East. The obvious partner is BSW. That's
Mhm.
the obvious partner. Now, the problem is Sarah, who's quite remarkable herself, insists that she would only go into coalition with a party that accepts her her party's stance on no more aid to Ukraine. And that's hard for the CDU. That's very hard. Now, on the state level, in some ways, you could say, who cares? They don't have much to do with foreign policy. But we'll see how that goes. And, one can, at the moment in Thuringia, I mean, there was this minority government that Romulo ran from Die
He has
Linke.
experience with that.
Yeah, and I think they did a pretty good job and so on, but I don't know how it's going to go. I think it may be easier in Saxony, where at least the CDU ran first. Now, in Thuringia, the AfD has the right to try to form a government first because they won the most seats. They won't do that, but I think it's going to be quite a long delay. To be honest, it's going to be hard to come up with more than half the seats in a coalition that works, particularly if they're trying to negotiate policies. I think it's going to be really interesting.
And in addition to that, even though the AfD did not win over 33% of the vote, my understanding is that they still have this so-called Sperrminorität, right? They have a blocking minority, which actually gives them a fair amount of power to continue to gum up the works for the government.
Yes, I think by the time the seats got done, when you factor in the votes of the people who didn't make it, the parties that didn't make it, and everything else, they did get that blocking thing, but it's designed to block. I mean, it's not really a positive thing. It's not like they can say, oh, let's change the constitution, but they can block judicial appointments, police appointments. I mean, you're right. I mean, people are going to have to talk to them. Now, one can certainly argue, it's my argument, it's not necessarily the most popular argument in Germany, but my argument is these people are voters. It's a democracy. They've expressed their opinion. One should listen to them.
Right.
And one should at least listen to them.
Well, and I think that's one of the big arguments is that democracy seems to be working in the East, given that there was a 74% turnout,
which was like last time, anyway, it was up by 7 or 8% over 2019.
Yeah.
So yeah, people came out to vote. Now, sometimes they voted just to put up two fingers, right? And sometimes they voted for certain policies. But, I talked to a lot of really rational people doing really well who were very tempted by a non-Nazi, right, Sarah Wagner kind of party that, shares many of the same views, particularly about Ukraine and about migration. Those are the two big issues. And about more pensions. I mean, in a way, they're both national socialist parties, right? But some of them plumped for the CDU just because they couldn't stand the idea of Hooke, because Hooke is kind of anathema, and they don't want to be Nazis, and they don't consider themselves Nazis, but they do feel left out and left behind. So there are issues, and the CDU is listening. I mean, they're already moving. The SPD is listening in its way too. I mean, and then of course this was accelerated by this horrible knife attack in Solingen, which I think helped the extreme parties also, but was not the first time.
Yeah.
And, it pointed again to inefficiency and deportation. This was a guy who was supposed to be deported back to Bulgaria, and somehow they missed the deadline, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So, there are all kinds of issues there. But I do think, there is this big debate in Europe. Now, the AfD is different, I think, because of its anti-constitutional stance, but also Wagenknecht wants to pull Germany out of, many things, not out of NATO, not out of the EU, as the AfD does, but very much wants to work like Maloney or Wilders to
Yeah.
alter these institutions.
And it seems like
So
she's
it's
trying
interesting.
to it seems like she's trying to leverage support at the state level into more influence at the federal level. Because I think she had said, it's not just going into a coalition at the state level and making sure or ensuring that their foreign policy views are, accepted by the coalition partner in the state. It's actually at the federal level. And
Yes,
so
yes, that's right.
she's trying to exert influence there. Let's turn to Saxony for a minute. I mean, the situation in Saxony is a little bit better, as you pointed out early on. The Christian Democrats came in ahead of the AfD, but just barely, with only 1% of the vote. The Ampel partners, the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Free Democrats, didn't even break 10% together collectively in Saxony. Um, what is the path forward there? I mean, obviously the CDU is in a little bit of a stronger position to continue its government under Michael Kretschmer. But can you talk a little bit about what's happening there?
Well, it's hard to, be too clear. I mean, you've explained it very well. I mean, I think Kretschmer should be able to form a government, but exactly with whom and how, and giving up what positions be much harder to say. I mean, it's like when you look even federally, elections are the end of September of next year, so they're 13 months away only, if the government lasts that long. It's hard to imagine what kind of coalition is going to come out of that, other than another mushy grand coalition, which drives everybody crazy and helps the extremes. So it's not just who runs the governments, it's the positions they take in order to have a coalition that functions, right? And one of the things Katja Wolf, who was the Wagner candidate in Thuringia, said, which I think is true, she got into some trouble by saying a very obvious thing, which was that, when we were Die Linke, when she was Die Linke, she's a mayor of a town also, we had good ideas and nobody listened to us because they just weren't going to deal with us. And the same issue is true with the AfD, and that's not a good thing. So we will listen to them if they have good ideas. And that created a big fuss, but in fact, it's only stating the obvious. I mean, in the end, it's compromise, it's coalition building. This is what Germany's good at. It's why I kind of trust Germany. I mean, I think it's a democracy that functions, that has protections and checks and balances. But if the AfD or even Wagner would run a government, I think there'd be big issues about intelligence sharing and about what happens with the police and so on and so on. So a lot of it will depend on what ministries they get and what responsibilities they get. And frankly, I don't know. I don't think any of us now know. But it's going to be messy and it's going to take a while and it's not going to be Armageddon. It's not. And then in Brandenburg, which is the 22nd, you have a much bigger, richer state where things will, the AfD is still ahead, but it only has 24% of the vote for the moment in the polls. And I think the result there will be, more like the rest of Germany, if not exactly like the rest.
Too, for the Social Democrats in Brandenburg, because it's been traditionally a stronger social democratic state, that they, will do better than they did in Thuringia and Saxony. But the question is sort of by how much? Because
I think they'll do a lot better, but the question is how much, and again, we'll have to see. The SPD is not popular in the country. The Greens are not popular in the country. The Free Democrats, just drive everybody crazy. They're very happy not to have their taxes raised, but it's when you look at the infrastructure and you think this is a rich country, it should be able to borrow a little money. But now we're back to the old debt brake debate, which you don't want to have and I don't want to have, because the whole thing drives me crazy.
So let's talk about something else, and that is, you mentioned the knife attack in Solingen, which obviously got worldwide attention. Just as you and I were getting ready to sit down to have this conversation, a meeting was starting in Berlin in the Ministry of the Interior, in the Innenministerium, between representatives from the current traffic light coalition, the opposition Christian Democrats, but also the states to talk about migration policy. Some have called it a summit, others have called it an exchange. This comes on the heels of some strong comments from Friedrich Merz, the head of the CDU, about migration and migration policy. And I even think that I heard today some reporting that if there weren't any results coming out of today's meeting, it didn't make sense to have any more conversations about this moving forward. Do you have high hopes or expectations of what might come out of this meeting today, given that migration was such a crucial topic for many voters in Saxony and Thuringia?
I'm not wonderfully optimistic about what any European country can do on its own on this issue. I mean, this is where the EU really matters, and this is where Schengen really matters, right? So, we all know the Dublin Agreement on movement is out of date. We all know the Convention on Refugees is way out of date. We all know these things. We also know that Germany desperately needs migrants. It needs somebody. It needs babies, right? I mean, it needs young people from wherever and however to come and go to school and become engineers and help make the airport work, which would be nice, or the trains, or the coffee shops. It needs people. So you have this enormous contradiction always, and it's true of every country, it's true in France as well, of the politics, which is very protectionist and insular and anxious, responding to popular fears and anxieties, and sometimes to real issues like knife crime and so on, versus the need of these countries to grow. The economies are stagnant, partly because they don't have enough people. And so any responsible government, and I think the CDU understands this also, has to balance this carefully. And also the EU has its own rules. So Scholz has talked very openly about trying to get a better agreement at the European Union level on asylum, new asylum rules, migration rules, and especially deportations. The big push here, as I understand it, is okay, crackdown on illegal migration, whatever that is, but it is to be quicker at deporting people who do not get granted asylum status. Now, it's always difficult because is Afghanistan considered a safe country? Is Turkey, blah, 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 blah. You always get court issues. Look at the trouble Britain has, when they tried to do this deal with Rwanda, and I think sent 4 people back at huge expense, and now has canned the whole idea. But legally, they can send people back. The big question is, will they stay where they're sent in the first place? Can you get them back? Or how you do better at integrating. I remember talking to Germans and Swedes, which had a big immigration issue in 2015 also, these two countries. And there's been a backlash in Sweden also. And part of it is because it takes 7 or 8 years to integrate people if they want to be integrated. Now, I talked to people in both these states who were very shaken by the AFD. I talked to an Iranian, a Kurdish couple, for instance. He's a nurse and he has degrees and he's very talented. And he says people pull back as soon as they see his skin color.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they don't want him to take their blood. He said, I have to live with this every day. And yet he can't go back to Kurdistan because he
Yeah.
was arrested there. I mean, he is a refugee. He's been there 6 or 7 years. He speaks good German, and he still feels like he's isolated. His wife has slightly lighter skin and somehow gets along better, but he's thinking of leaving. I talked to a Kosovo doctor, a doctor who works in a hospital, who says he's getting ready to leave. He can't stand it. So, I mean, these are real issues. And then the worries are economically, and I'll stop, but economically, that the more you get this racist anti-migration tone, the less likely it is industries will attract workers that
Hmm.
they need to work in these states,
Yeah.
right? So it's not easy for the federal government. I appreciate they're trying to deal with it and talk about it, but there's no answer, right?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
No, there's definitely not an easy answer, and it was interesting. I guess on Sunday I heard an interview on Deutschlandradio with some Mittelstand representatives from Saxony and Thuringia, basically, family-owned businesses who were saying that they are suffering from the need for skilled labor and that they
Totally.
recognize that they need to bring people from abroad to fill those positions.
Mhm.
Um, Election results like the ones that happened on Sunday make it that much more difficult to attract people who look different to places
Yes.
like Saxony and Thuringia.
And
It's
and there's
really,
also decency there too. I mean, in the sense, I talked to a Nigerian woman who smuggled herself in through Libya and Italy and spent years in Italy, didn't like it, managed to get to Germany. She's sitting on a bench in Weimar with this gorgeous purple dyed hair, and she's so happy. She said she's learned to read and write in Germany. I mean, people have been really nice to her. And she said, when they're racist, I ignore it. I don't care. Right. I mean, she's happy as she can be. The government has helped her bring another son to Germany to join her. So there's decency too. We shouldn't forget this, right?
so, um, as we sort of start to wrap up, I'd like to fold in one more viewer question, which is uh, from someone who's curious whether these election results at the state level will affect the governing coalition's foreign policy at all. Do you think that there could be an impact there?
Well, I think there will be, and there already is slightly at the margins. I mean, partly everyone talks about it in terms of the money crunch, right?
Hmm.
The debt break. So even for 2025, Germany's already said it's going to have the amount of aid it gives to Ukraine, and hope that using the frozen Russian assets will make up the difference.
Hmm.
That's still debated. Now, the issue becomes the debt break and how much money there is and so on. But there's also, I mean, part of this is simply that the country is very worried, particularly the opposition parties are very worried about how long the war in Ukraine will last and
Hmm.
how much money it's going to cost and whether Germany is going to get dragged in. It's an issue for the CDU, which has been pretty much pro-Ukraine. Scholz has always played this weird, I think he's had his finger on the pulse pretty well on this issue when he says, Ukraine can't lose and Russia can't win.
Hmm.
Now, that's a formula for stalemate,
Hmm.
right? That's a formula for stalemate followed by negotiations, which is exactly what this government wants. And all the extremists are saying is, well, I mean, what Sarah Wagner is saying is, I don't like Putin, I don't trust him, but people are dying, so let's negotiate and end the war anyway. And the AfD is just saying, let Putin do whatever he wants.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is having an impact. I think it will have an impact on the SPD in particular. It's already having an impact on the CDU in terms of migration policy. So yeah, I mean, in a way, you can say they're responding to voters, but again, let's not exaggerate the
Yeah.
number of voters that voted
Yeah.
on Sunday, and look at national figures. Again, the great debate is: do you weaken the AfD by bringing them into politics and making them complicit in government the way
Hmm.
other European countries have done? You'll probably do that with BSW. Or do you make them stronger by keeping the cordon sanitaire, and so they can say, nobody listens to us, we're going to
Right.
keep being the protest party? And that I can't answer, but that's a big debate here.
Yeah. It's a very big debate, particularly since it really seems as if the AfD does not have real answers to any of the big questions, or to address any of the real challenges that are facing Germany right now. You alluded to this. The population of Thuringia is only 2.6% of the total German population. Saxony is only about 5%. Um, there's been a lot of reporting over the last couple of days that the AfD is turning into a Volkspartei, or a mass party. I don't know that that's a fair conclusion to draw from, barely 8% of the nation's population voting um, favorably for the AfD. But it is obviously something to watch.
Well, it is something to watch because it is a real extremist party, which is
Yeah.
why Sarah Wagenknecht has an opportunity. I mean, there is a constituency out there to pick up where you can feel you're against the elite and against the government, but you're not a Nazi.
Yeah.
And this is a very, this is a niche. This is a very clever niche. And it's not just a far left party. It obviously isn't. She's trying to make it being a non-ideological party. When I asked her if it was a Leninist party, she got quite annoyed with me. I did it as something of a joke, but she said, we're not a Cotter party. I don't think anyone remembers even what a
Right.
Cotter is, but it is very much a personalist party.
Yeah.
Wolf Biermann said it's very much like authoritarian parties of the past. We'll see.
So, Steve, one final question, and that has to do with sort of how secure the governing coalition is. I thought discussions had sort of died down, calling into question the future of the traffic light coalition in Berlin. The sense was September of 2025, that's when the election will take place, and that this government will hold. After this election, questions are bubbling up again about whether or not the government will hold. Obviously, for the next 3 weeks, I think not much is going to happen. People are going to wait until the state elections in Brandenburg. We'll see how those go. But what are your thoughts on whether this government will hold or not?
Well, they're more impressions than thoughts. I mean, I just think, even turkeys don't vote for Thanksgiving, right? I mean, why? I mean, if you think you can regain ground, if you think the economy can come back, if you think you can do more about migration, if why end it sooner rather than later? Because right now, all those three parties are really unpopular. It seems pretty clear the CDU would get the CDU-CSU would probably get the most votes in a federal election, and then with whom is
Right.
always the question. But I just feel like usually governments don't commit suicide. Now, in Britain they did, but so
Right.
it can happen. But I don't see people in the streets demanding the government
No.
resign. It's not like Israel, right?
No.
So I
No.
suspect they'll hold on. Now maybe they'll decide to call it, earlier in September, or I don't know what. But
But it
I may be well wrong. I have to say, but at the
well,
moment I can't see them doing it.
we'll obviously have to see what happens, but it comes back to something that you said very early on, that this, in our conversation today, many of these debates and exchanges are happening within the bubble of the political elite in Berlin, right? This is not something where you're seeing people taking to the streets and demanding a new government. On the contrary, It's more, when you think about some of the statements that just came out today from a senior FDP Bundestag member, after the FDP had such a poor showing both in Thuringia and in Saxony, calling into question the government at the federal level. This really is sort of an internal discussion that's unfolding at the moment.
Yeah. And also, I mean, there will be debates about who should be the chancellor candidates.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a serious debate too. So,
Yeah.
I think Merz has done pretty well for himself this time so far. That seems okay, but Scholz, who knows?
Well, and this
Wir
is
sehen.
that bubbled up just over the last day or so, where Markus Söder, who's been on again, off again about being a chancellor candidate for the CDU, CSU, started to make some noises that he wouldn't say no. So I think across the board, the Kanzlerfrage is in question, except perhaps for the Greens, although it's unlikely that they would be able to put somebody into the chancellery.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I would say is that underneath there is a lot of turmoil in the German party system. And it's not just in the East, it's everywhere. I mean, things are moving. And even in Germany, which can look very stable, it's moving. And we need to keep watching it very carefully.
Well, Steve, thank you for watching this carefully with us. Thanks for sharing your insights. This has been wonderful. And I look forward to catching up with you again in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you very much, and all the listeners.